Whether you're sitting in a top executive boardroom looking at a spreadsheet.
Or you're a frontline employee, like
Yeah.
pouring coffee or working a cash register.
Yeah, exactly. You have almost certainly lived through it. That messy corporate reorganization or maybe a massive new software rollout that just completely spectacularly flops.
Yeah.
The emails come down from corporate headquarters, the shiny new mission statement gets printed on a poster in the break room, and then,
Nothing.
right, nothing really changes. Or worse, everything just grinds to a chaotic halt, and everyone is absolutely miserable.
It is a universally frustrating professional experience, isn't it? I mean, it leaves executives wondering why nobody's following the instructions, and it leaves the employees feeling completely burned out. They're just wondering why leadership forced this system on them that clearly looked good on paper but fails miserably in practice.
And that disconnect is exactly our mission for today's deep dive. We're exploring the evolution of change management as a vital management discipline. We're pulling from two incredibly comprehensive academic chapters that detail the structural, the psychological, and, the theoretical models of how organizations actually change.
Right.
Specifically, we're going to focus on the renowned work of organizational behavior expert John P. Cotter. We're going to decode exactly why those big corporate rollouts fail and how the most agile organizations today are actually pulling off continuous change without burning out their teams.
To really understand this, though, we need to set the historical stage a bit. If you look back just a few decades, organizational change was seen as, well, a rare, isolated event.
Like a one-off thing.
Exactly. A company would operate with total stability for years, sometimes decades. Then some major market disruption would happen. They'd go through this really painful period of adjustment and then return to a long period of stable operations.
Right.
But in modern organizations, driven by intense technological complexity, rapid global supply chains, instant communication change is no longer an exception. It's a constant fundamental condition of existing in the business world today.
So what does this all mean? We went from thinking of change as this, rare corporate eclipse to treating it as an everyday necessary management discipline.
Yeah.
And to understand how we manage change today, we first have to look at the classic, rational models that build the very foundation of the discipline. We have to go back to 1947 to a theorist named Kurt Lewin.
Yes.
He formulated what is famously known as the three-step model: unfreeze, change, and refreeze.
Lewin viewed organizations as systems existing in a state of dynamic equilibrium. His core insight was that when people resist change, it's usually not just, individuals being naturally stubborn.
Right.
The resistance is actually the result of systemic forces keeping the status quo firmly in place.
It's like remodeling an old house, right?
Yeah.
You can't just slap a heavy new kitchen island on top of a rotting floorboard.
No.
First, you have to break down the old walls and tear up the old floors. That's the unfreeze phase, where you actively destabilize the old routines. Then you build a new layout, put in the new plumbing. That's the actual change. And finally, you let the paint dry and the cement set, so it becomes the new permanent normal. That's the refreeze.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And you also have to consider what those forces of the status quo actually are in a corporate setting. I mean, it's the way the annual budget is set, the way year-end bonuses are structured, the reporting lines.
Totally.
You have to actively unfreeze those structural forces before anyone will adopt a new behavior. But as we moved into the 1980s and 90s, the business environment sped up dramatically.
Yeah, the ice cube model just became way too slow. You don't have the luxury of time to carefully refreeze the ice when the entire global market is boiling around you.
Exactly.
Organizations needed continuous adaptation. And that brings us to John P. Cotter. Cotter shifted the focus entirely away from just looking at the psychology of group dynamics.
Yeah.
And he focused heavily on the role of leadership in structuring and sustaining change.
Right, because the assumptions underlying Lewin's model were simply being overwhelmed by intense global competition. Cotter realized that change management needed a more robust, actionable framework for the people actually running the companies.
And Cotter didn't just sit in an ivory tower and theorize this, right? He did a massive empirical study. Over a 10-year period, he analyzed more than 100 companies undergoing major transformations. We're talking everything from total corporate restructurings to massive cultural turnarounds. And his findings were, honestly, really surprising. When these massive initiatives failed, it was rarely because the underlying strategy was bad or because they lacked technical expertise.
The strategy was often perfectly fine. The failure was almost always in the process. It was a failure of management.
Wow.
Yeah. Based on the data from those 100 companies, Cotter mapped out 8 fundamental recurring managerial errors. And from those specific errors, he created his famous 8-step model for change.
Right.
It's essentially a sequential checklist, a highly rational approach for management to ensure momentum and organizational buy-in.
And let's look at how rational this is. Step 1, step 2, step 3. Step 1 is where Cotter found that over half of these major corporate transformations failed right out of the gate.
Yeah, the failure to establish a perceived need.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning leadership couldn't even convince the organization that the status quo was actually dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Then step 2 is building a guiding coalition of powerful people to lead the change. Step 3 is formulating a strategic vision, and so on, all the way to step 8, which is anchoring the new approaches in the corporate culture.
What's fascinating here is Cotter's crucial distinction between management and leadership. In his framework, management is about planning, budgeting, coordination, and control. It keeps the trains running on time.
Right.
Leadership is entirely different. Leadership is about formulating that vision, setting a direction, managing uncertainty, and actually mobilizing human beings.
Because you can't just manage a massive change through a beautiful spreadsheet.
Yeah.
You have to actually lead people through it. The 8-step model was designed to give leaders a disciplined top-down structure.
Yeah.
It clarifies which managerial actions are necessary and exactly when they should be implemented. It treats change as a highly structured, logical process.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. If Cotter spent a whole decade studying 100 actual companies, and he built this incredibly logical, step-by-step roadmap based on real-world data, how could his 8-step model be so disconnected from the reality of the front lines today?
Wow.
Didn't he see the middle managers, the baristas, and the dental hygienists struggling with these top-down mandates during his decade of research?
You have to consider the historical context of his research. Those 100 companies Cotter studied in the 80s and 90s were largely traditional, highly hierarchical monoliths.
Okay.
The fatal flaw of the 8-step model, when applied today, is its severe sequential rigidity and its heavy top-down orientation.
Right.
It assumes change as a linear sequence where step 1 finishes perfectly across the entire company before step 2 begins. Modern organizations unfold change in a much more fragmented, parallel way.
And the model treats the frontline employees primarily as just implementing agents. The executives at the top do all the complex thinking, they define the grand vision, and the employees are just expected to execute the plan without questioning it.
And that approach completely falls apart in modern organizations that rely on high local autonomy.
Yeah.
The sources provide a great lens on this by looking at Scandinavian management models, which are traditionally characterized by low power distance and a high degree of employee independence. We have 2 specific case studies mentioned, Tandlägen.dk, which is a large network of dental clinics, and Joe and the Juice, a highly decentralized retail coffee and juice chain.
Let's look at the dental clinics.
Yeah.
You have a local clinic manager. Corporate headquarters decides to roll out a brand new patient booking software, and they use Cotter's 8 steps.
Right?
They establish the urgency, they build the coalition at headquarters, and they send the mandate down. But the local clinic manager has a waiting room full of patients, dentists complaining about the new interface, and a receptionist who doesn't even understand the training manual. If corporate just says, implement step 4 by Friday, that manager is trapped.
Those local managers have to balance the new corporate demands with their daily operations, their staff's well-being, and their local customer needs. If top management forces a rigid mandate without involving those local managers in the translation of that change, it creates immense friction.
Totally.
It leads to change fatigue, widespread resistance, and a feeling of lost control on the front lines.
In the academic literature, they call this a lack of sense-making. But, in conversational terms, it just means bypassing the need for employees to sit around the break room and figure out what the new policy actually means for their Tuesday morning shift.
Right.
You can't just email a new operational manual to a store manager who is already working a 50-hour week and expect seamless execution.
The change does not happen magically all at once. It happens socially. People don't just read an email from the CEO and instantly alter their daily habits. They look around to see how their immediate peers are reacting.
Which brings us to the mechanics of how human beings actually adopt new ideas. If you're that dental receptionist, you wait to see if the new software crashes when your coworker uses it before you try it yourself.
That peer-to-peer observation is the core of Everett Rogers' diffusion of innovation theory, which is a vital concept in our sources. Change spreads organically through a population, much like mixing two liquids together.
Okay.
Rogers identified that people adopt change in 5 distinct phases: knowledge, persuasion, decision, implementation, and confirmation.
It's a fundamentally social process.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that social dynamic, Rogers categorized a population into 5 groups based on how quickly they adopt change.
Mm-hmm.
You have the innovators. These are the risk takers in the office. They're the ones downloading the beta version of the software just to see what it does.
Following them are the early adopters, who are usually respected opinion leaders within the informal social network of the office.
Right.
When the early adopters embrace a change, it sends a powerful psychological signal to the rest of the organization that the new system is safe and beneficial.
Then you hit the big groups. The early majority, who are pragmatic, they watch the early adopters in the break room, see that the new software isn't causing chaos, and they jump on board.
Yeah.
Then the late majority, who are skeptical and usually only change because of peer pressure or because the old system is finally turned off. And finally, the laggards.
The laggards are deeply anchored in the old ways. They might perceive the change as a direct threat to their professional identity or their hard-earned competence.
Wow, yeah.
The massive problem with Cotter's original 8-step model is that it completely ignored this organic social diffusion. It expected the entire organization to move as one monolithic block from step 3 to step 4.
Think about your own team for a second. You probably know exactly who your laggards are. The ones who roll their eyes when a new initiative is announced.
Oh, definitely.
The classic top-down model wastes a massive amount of energy trying to force those laggards to change on day one, completely ignoring the psychological safety and employee involvement required to actually shift their mindset.
And Cotter eventually realized this. He saw that his rigid top-down approach was actually stifling the very people who needed to adapt. A strict sequential checklist simply does not survive contact with a complex autonomous workforce.
Right.
He needed to find a way to balance the need for stable, predictable daily operations with the need for rapid, continuous, organic change.
He had to evolve his theory. And this leads to his later, perhaps most crucial contribution to change management. In response to the glaring failures of top-down rollouts, Cotter introduced the accelerator model, which is also heavily referred to as the dual operating system.
Yes, the dual operating system proposes that modern companies cannot rely on a single hierarchical structure. They need 2 systems functioning simultaneously.
Think of the formal hierarchy of a company like the skeleton of the human body. The skeleton is rigid, it's structured, and it handles the stable daily operations. It keeps everything standing up straight. It makes sure the bills get paid, the legal compliance is met, and the shifts are covered. But the skeleton cannot react quickly to a sudden threat. You need a second system. The new parallel system, the informal network, is like the human nervous system.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. The nervous system feels the environment. If you touch a hot stove, your nervous system instantly reacts and pulls your hand away before your brain even fully processes the pain.
Exactly.
The informal network in a company operates the same way. It's constantly learning, adapting, and sending signals everywhere at lightning speed.
And Cotter's core insight here is that these 2 systems are not competing with each other. They're permanent, parallel structures that use the exact same people.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you don't build a separate innovation department and stick them in a glass room. The informal network is organized around voluntary participation and shared goals, actively bypassing the slow, formal chains of command.
And in this new model, Cotter completely abandons the strict step-by-step sequence. In the 8-step model, you had to finish step 2 before step 3. In the accelerator model, he introduces 8 accelerators, and they operate simultaneously and continuously.
Right. It's a system designed for sustained, ongoing change rather than a one-off project with a start and end date.
To fuel those continuous accelerators, there's a fundamental shift in how leaders motivate their teams. In the old model, and in Lewin's unfreezing concept, change was almost always driven by a burning platform, a crisis, a severe threat.
Yeah.
Leadership would say, you must change immediately, or the company will go bankrupt and we all lose our jobs.
But psychological research clearly shows that when changes are perceived as threats, human beings activate defensive mechanisms. Resistance skyrockets.
Obviously.
People do not innovate when they're terrified of losing their livelihoods. They hunker down and protect their immediate territory.
They just freeze up. So instead of a burning platform, the accelerator model rallies people around a positive, big opportunity. It's a logic of potential and development. It's not change or we die. It's look at this incredible industry-defining thing we could build together.
Framing the change around a big opportunity drastically reduces defensive behavior. It allows the organization to mobilize what Cotter calls a volunteer army.
A volunteer army.
Exactly. This volunteer army is the absolute engine of the informal network. It consists of employees from all levels, frontline workers, respected middle managers, specialized technicians who actively choose to engage in driving the change.
Because they aren't assigned to a mandatory task force by their boss. They volunteer because they genuinely believe in the big opportunity. This totally bypasses the slow middle management bottlenecks.
Right.
You aren't waiting for a vice president to approve a memo, to send to a director, to tell a regional manager to instruct a barista. The barista and the director are in the exact same informal network, sharing knowledge and testing ideas instantly.
And the most striking data point from this model is the critical mass required. You do not need everyone in the company to volunteer. You only need about 10% of the workforce acting as that volunteer army to generate unstoppable momentum.
Wow. Just 10%.
Just 10%.
So if you have 10% of your people acting as those innovators and early adopters we talked about from Rogers' diffusion theory, they will create enough visible success and peer-to-peer influence to pull the early majority, the late majority, and eventually the laggards along with them.
Yes. The accelerator theory directly solves the fatal flaw of the 8-step model. It takes change management from being a rational top-down exercise and turns it into a socially driven movement. It puts employee involvement, psychological safety, and informal cross-functional collaboration at the very center of the process. The hierarchy, the skeleton, keeps the lights on and handles the budget, while the network, the nervous system, drives the continuous evolution.
It bridges the massive gap between structural change management and the psychological reality of how human beings actually adopt new behaviors.
It acknowledges that in modern organizations, especially those with high autonomy like our dental clinics and juice bars, you absolutely cannot mandate genuine engagement.
No, you can't.
You have to design an environment where it naturally flourishes.
We've traced a significant evolution in how management views the workplace here. We started with Kurt Lewin's slow-melting ice cubes, treating change as a rare disruption that needed to be carefully frozen back into place.
Right.
Then we moved to John P. Cotter's massive 100-company study, which introduced change management as a vital, rational discipline with his 8-step model. It was a great checklist for boardrooms, sure, but we saw how it failed on the front lines because it ignored employee involvement and the way real people socially adopt new ideas.
Exactly. And finally, we arrived at the Agile Dual Operating System and the accelerator theory. We learned that while traditional formal hierarchies are absolutely necessary for minimizing risk and keeping the daily operations stable, they are terrible at adapting quickly.
Yeah.
It's the informal volunteer networks, powered by a big opportunity rather than a burning platform, that truly drive continuous organic change without a specific, rigid order.
The skeleton and the nervous system working together.
This raises an important question, though, for anyone trying to navigate today's relentless business environment. Successful change is less about forcing compliance through a rigid structural chart and far more about creating the open space for employees to actively participate in the translation of that change into their daily lives.
Treating your people like active participants rather than just implementing agents, that's really the only way to survive continuous disruption. Which brings us to a final thought for you to mull over. Look around your own workplace tomorrow morning. When a new initiative inevitably drops from corporate, observe how it's handled. Are your leaders just pushing it down the formal hierarchy chart, hoping everyone simply obeys the email?
Or are they tapping into the hidden electrifying power of your informal network?
Exactly. Are they building a volunteer army around a big opportunity? Because understanding the difference between those two approaches might just be the difference between the survival or the slow collapse of your company. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.